People think this operation was about sanctions or shipping lanes. It wasn't. It was a strategic message sent before rivals could react, and it landed exactly where it was meant to. For decades, the American public was told that U.S. foreign interventions revolved around resources, oil above all else. I sat inside the intelligence system long enough to know that explanation was always incomplete and often intentionally misleading. Oil was never the driver, it was the excuse. What mattered was power, leverage, and timing. Who could shape events before rivals could respond, and who controlled the narrative long enough to make escalation appear inevitable rather than chosen. Inside intelligence briefings, the language was clinical. We talked about energy security, market stability, and supply disruption. But the underlying assessments focused on geopolitical positioning, choke points, alliance signaling, and the credibility of coercion. When those briefings were translated for policymakers and then for the public, the complexity disappeared. Oil became the headline. Timing vanished. Power calculations were buried. That distortion wasn't accidental, it was useful. Take Venezuela. Publicly, sanctions and maritime seizures were framed as enforcement actions tied to oil smuggling and sanctions violations. Privately, the intelligence conversation revolved around whether Washington could act faster than Moscow could respond, whether escalation could be normalized before rivals established deterrence, and whether domestic audiences could be kept focused on legality rather than strategy. When U.S. forces moved to seize a sanctioned tanker in the North Atlantic before Russian naval assets could arrive, that wasn't about cargo. The vessel was reportedly empty. It was about signaling initiative, seizing tempo, and proving that the United States could still impose outcomes unilaterally if it moved first. This is where intelligence failure becomes strategic failure. Analysts knew that Russia and China were no longer passive observers. We knew reaction times were shrinking, that multipolar competition had compressed decision windows, yet intelligence assessments continued to frame actions as isolated enforcement measures rather than escalatory signals in a crowded strategic environment. By stripping timing and power from the narrative, we blinded policymakers to second and third order effects. The consequence was predictable. Each action designed to demonstrate control instead exposed vulnerability. Every seizure, sanction, or pressure campaign reinforced the perception that Washington was reacting, not shaping. Intelligence became less about warning and more about justification. Once that happens, credibility erodes, not because enemies disbelieve you, but because allies stop trusting your judgment. The hard lesson is simple. When intelligence allows a myth like resource wars to replace real strategic analysis, policy becomes performance. And performance collapses the moment someone else controls the clock. By the time I left government service, the most dangerous shift I had witnessed wasn't a lack of information, it was the repurposing of intelligence from warning to persuasion. Intelligence is supposed to tell policymakers what they do not want to hear, especially when assumptions are wrong or risks are escalating. Instead, the system gradually inverted. Analysis began with policy preference and worked backward, shaping assessments to support decisions already made. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't require conspiracies. It emerged through incentives, career pressure, and an institutional fear of being the analyst who disrupted consensus. Once intelligence becomes a sales product, truth becomes optional, and timing becomes everything. Analysts learn quickly that uncertainty is unwelcome, that nuance slows momentum, and that framing matters more than accuracy. Estimates stop asking whether an action will succeed and start arguing why failure is unlikely. Dissenting views are not banned, they are buried in footnotes, softened with caveats, or delayed until they no longer matter. In this environment, intelligence no longer constrains power, it lubricates it. I watched assessments on sanctions effectiveness, regime stability, and foreign military response gradually lose their analytical spine. Worst-case scenarios were dismissed as low probability, not because evidence disproved them, but because acknowledging them would complicate policy rollout. Over time, analysts internalized the message. Intelligence that stalls action is intelligence that harms careers. The strategic consequence was profound. Policymakers began treating intelligence as confirmation rather than evaluation, assuming that if something appeared in a briefing slide, it had already survived rigorous challenge. In reality, much of it had survived only bureaucratic filtering. This distortion fed directly into foreign policy failures. Actions were taken on compressed timelines under the assumption that rivals would hesitate, fracture, or defer. When those assumptions proved false, the response was not reassessment, but escalation. Intelligence was then tasked to explain why previous estimates were mostly right rather than why they were wrong. That feedback loop is lethal. It teaches institutions nothing while convincing them they are learning. The analytical breakdown here is stark. Intelligence stopped functioning as an early warning system and became a narrative enabler. Once that happens, strategic surprise becomes inevitable, not because information is missing, but because it is ignored. The hard lesson intelligence refused to learn is that credibility is not built by supporting power. It is built by restraining it when restraint is warranted. When intelligence sells policy instead of interrogating it, failure stops being accidental and becomes structural. Sanctions were sold as precision tools, clean, reversible, and strategically elegant. In practice, they became substitutes for strategy. I watched sanctions regimes expand from targeted pressure mechanisms into blunt instruments deployed to demonstrate resolve when policymakers lacked viable options. Intelligence assessments initially acknowledged their limits. Adaptive networks, alternative currencies, third-party intermediaries, and the inevitable consolidation of sanctioned states into counter systems. Over time, those assessments were revised not because facts changed, but because admitting diminishing returns threatened the illusion of control. Sanctions became performative, a way to signal action while avoiding hard strategic choices. Maritime seizures followed the same path. Boarding vessels, freezing assets, and publicizing enforcement actions created the appearance of dominance, but they rarely altered adversary behavior in durable ways. Instead, they accelerated adaptation. Networks learned to obscure ownership, reroute logistics, and exploit jurisdictional seams faster than enforcement could track them. Intelligence flagged these adaptations repeatedly, yet the policy response was to escalate enforcement rather than reassess effectiveness. Each seizure was framed as success. The strategic environment it produced was ignored. The illusion lay in mistaking activity for leverage. Control is not demonstrated by how often you act, but by how reliably your actions shape outcomes. Sanctions and seizures increasingly failed that test. They hardened adversary resolve, legitimized countermeasures, and normalized risk-taking. Worse, they trained U.S. institutions to equate visibility with effectiveness. If an action generated headlines and talking points, it was deemed successful regardless of strategic fallout. Intelligence reporting adapted accordingly. Measures of success shifted from behavioral change to compliance statistics and enforcement counts. That shift masked the erosion of deterrence. Adversaries learned that U.S. responses were predictable, procedural, and constrained by self-imposed narratives. Timing again became decisive. By the time Washington acted, rivals had already priced in the response. The strategic consequence was a shrinking menu of options. As sanctions lost potency, policymakers doubled down rather than pivoted, trapping themselves in escalation ladders they had not designed. Intelligence warnings about spillover effects, energy markets, alliance fatigue, legal backlash were acknowledged but deprioritized. The system preferred the certainty of action over the ambiguity of restraint. The analytical breakdown is clear. Sanctions and seizures were treated as ends in themselves, not as tools subordinate to strategy. Once that inversion occurs, control becomes theatrical. The hard lesson is unforgiving. Power exercised without strategic effect is not power at all, it is exposure. And intelligence that fails to say that plainly becomes complicit in the illusion. Venezuela was not a policy problem in isolation. It was a diagnostic test of the entire American national security system, and it failed on every measurable axis, from intelligence collection to analysis. From policy formulation to execution, the same distortions repeated themselves until dysfunction became normalized. What should have been a contained regional issue turned into a showcase of how narrative-driven policy corrodes institutional judgment. Intelligence assessments on Venezuela were saturated with assumptions that had long outlived their evidentiary support: imminent regime collapse, decisive popular opposition, fractured security services, and international isolation. Those assumptions were recycled year after year despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Reporting that contradicted the collapse narrative was treated as noise, anomaly, or regime deception rather than data demanding reassessment. The intelligence failure was not one of access. We had reporting from human sources, signals, economic indicators, and regional partners. The failure was interpretive. Analysts were pressured, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, to frame developments in ways that preserve policy momentum. When sanctions devastated civilian infrastructure without producing political capitulation, intelligence was tasked to explain why pressure had not yet reached critical mass, not whether the underlying theory was flawed. When opposition movements failed to mobilize at scale, reporting emphasized repression rather than legitimacy gaps. When foreign support, particularly from Russia, stabilized the regime, it was framed as temporary interference rather than structural realignment. The strategic consequence was paralysis disguised as persistence. Policy options narrowed to variations of the same approach: more sanctions, louder threats, symbolic enforcement actions. Intelligence warnings about diminishing leverage and rising external entanglement were acknowledged but sidelined. Venezuela became a sunk cost problem, where admitting failure was perceived as more damaging than continuing a strategy that no longer functioned. This is how systems fail, not through sudden collapse, but through incremental self-deception. The analytical breakdown reveals a deeper pathology. Venezuela was treated as a morality play rather than a geopolitical system. Intelligence analysis blurred into advocacy, and advocacy hardened into dogma. Once that line was crossed, every development was interpreted through a predetermined lens. Adaptation stopped. Learning ceased. The intelligence community became reactive, explaining outcomes after they occurred rather than anticipating them. The hard lesson Venezuela delivered is brutal. When intelligence serves narrative first and reality second, policy loses its corrective mechanism. Failure no longer triggers reassessment, it triggers justification. And once an institution reaches that stage, the problem is no longer the target state. The problem is the system looking at it. The most persistent analytical blind spot I witnessed was the refusal to take timing seriously as a strategic variable, especially where Russia was concerned. U.S. Intelligence understood Russian capabilities in broad terms, but it consistently underestimated Moscow's ability to act opportunistically within narrow windows created by American indecision and narrative inertia. Russia did not need parity with the United States. It needed synchronization. It waited for moments when Washington was committed rhetorically but constrained operationally, when policy had momentum but strategy had none. Intelligence reporting identified these patterns repeatedly, yet assessments continued to frame Russian actions as reactive rather than anticipatory. That mischaracterization mattered. It encouraged policymakers to believe escalation could be managed, that Russia would calibrate its responses to avoid confrontation. Instead, Moscow calibrated its timing to exploit U.S. hesitation. In Venezuela, this dynamic was unmistakable. Russian financial security and diplomatic engagement did not surge impulsively. It aligned precisely with moments when U.S. pressure peaked without delivering results, when sanctions intensified, Russian involvement deepened. When regime change rhetoric escalated, Moscow increased its visible support not to provoke conflict, but to impose decision costs. Intelligence assessments often acknowledged Russian presence while downplaying its strategic significance, treating it as symbolic or transactional. That framing missed the point. Russia was not defending Venezuela for ideological reasons. It was testing whether the United States could still impose outcomes unchallenged in its own declared sphere of influence. The strategic consequence of misreading timing was cumulative erosion. Each instance where Russia acted and the United States failed to respond decisively or wisely reinforced a perception of constraint. Allies noticed, adversaries learned. Intelligence should have been the mechanism that forced recalibration, but instead it became a chronicler of events already in motion. Analytical confidence persisted even as predictive accuracy declined. The breakdown here lies in outdated mental models. U.S. intelligence continued to analyze competition as if it were sequential action, response, escalation, when it had become simultaneous and multi-domain. Timing was no longer measured in months or years, but in days and narratives. By the time intelligence products reached decision makers, the strategic window had often closed. That delay was not technical, it was institutional. Intelligence was optimized for validation, not anticipation. The hard lesson is unavoidable. In a multipolar system, power belongs to those who act within the window, not those who dominate the balance sheet. When intelligence fails to prioritize timing, it produces accurate descriptions of a world that no longer exists. And policy built on that foundation will always arrive too late. Narrative warfare was originally conceived as an external tool, something used to influence adversaries, reassure allies, and shape international perception. Over time, I watched that tool turn inward, contaminating the intelligence process itself. What began as strategic communication bled into analysis, blurring the line between describing reality and defending policy. Intelligence products increasingly reflected what leaders needed the public to believe rather than what decision makers needed to know. Once that inversion took hold, self-deception became institutionalized. The mechanism was subtle. Analysts were not instructed to lie, they were encouraged to frame. Language softened. Uncertainty was managed. Estimates emphasized continuity over rupture, resilience over fragility. When policies were sold publicly as calibrated and lawful, intelligence was expected to mirror that tone. Assessments that highlighted escalation risk or legal ambiguity were delayed or diluted. Over time, analysts internalized the narrative constraints. They learned which questions advanced careers and which stalled them. The result was a form of cognitive capture where intelligence ceased to be an independent input and became a supporting actor in a broader messaging campaign. The strategic consequence was profound distortion. Narrative coherence replaced analytical rigor as the metric of success. If a policy could be explained cleanly to domestic audiences, it was assumed to be strategically sound. Intelligence that complicated the story was treated as a liability. This inward turn eroded trust within the system. Policymakers began to doubt intelligence not because it was wrong, but because it was predictable. Analysts, sensing that doubt, compensated by reinforcing consensus rather than challenging it. The feedback loop tightened. The analytical breakdown is clear. Intelligence cannot function when it is tasked explicitly or implicitly to protect narratives. Reality does not negotiate with messaging. When facts diverge from storylines, the divergence grows over time. By the time it becomes undeniable, options have narrowed and costs have multiplied. Venezuela, sanctions enforcement, and great power competition all reflected this pattern. Intelligence described actions as controlled and reversible, even as evidence mounted that they were neither. The hard lesson is uncomfortable. Narrative warfare is corrosive when misapplied. Used externally, it can shape perception. Used internally, it blinds institutions. Once intelligence becomes an extension of public messaging, it loses its capacity to warn. And without warning, strategy degenerates into reaction. The final failure was not tactical, operational, or even strategic. It was epistemic. The American intelligence system lost its ability to distinguish between knowing and believing. By the end, assessments were no longer anchored in the question of what was true, but in what was sustainable, politically, narratively, and institutionally. That shift is fatal for any intelligence service. Once belief replaces evaluation, correction becomes impossible. Errors no longer trigger learning, they trigger rationalization. I watched this happen in real time as successive failures were explained away as anomalies rather than symptoms. The accumulated strategic consequence was a collapse of credibility that no military defeat was required to produce. Allies began hedging not because they doubted American power, but because they doubted American judgment. Adversaries stopped fearing escalation and started managing it. Intelligence warnings that once carried weight became background noise, indistinguishable from policy talking points. When everything sounds confident, nothing sounds credible. The analytical breakdown can be traced to a single refusal: the refusal to accept limits. Intelligence is supposed to define constraints on power, on timelines, on outcomes. Instead, it was tasked with preserving optionality, keeping narratives alive long after evidence had invalidated them. This produced a strategic environment where the United States acted often but learned little. Each intervention, sanction, or seizure reinforced institutional habits rather than corrected them. The system mistook persistence for resilience. The hard lesson intelligence refused to learn is brutally simple. Credibility is not maintained by insisting you are right. It is maintained by demonstrating that you can admit when you are wrong and adjust accordingly. In a multipolar world, that ability matters more than force projection. Rivals exploit rigidity. Allies distrust denial. Intelligence that cannot challenge power becomes decoration, not defense. When intelligence becomes fiction, strategy follows it into irrelevance. The collapse of the American strategic narrative did not occur because others lied better. It occurred because the system stopped telling itself the truth. That is not an external threat. It is an internal one. And until it is confronted, no amount of power, timing, or narrative management will restore what was lost.